Versailles is one of those places that almost punishes simple descriptions. If you call it beautiful, that is true, but far too weak. If you call it extravagant, that is also true, but still not enough. If you call it a palace, you are technically correct, yet you still have not said what it really was. Because Versailles was not simply a residence, it was not simply a monument, it was not simply the home of kings and queens wrapped in marble, mirrors, gold leaf, and perfect gardens. Versailles was a machine built to control people through awe. It was a theatre that never closed. It was a stage on which daily life itself was rewritten into ceremony. It was a glittering lie, but an effective one. It was a masterpiece. It was a trap. It was one of the most brilliant political inventions in European history. And in the end, it became one of the most dangerous symbols a monarchy could possibly have. That is what makes Versailles so difficult to look away from. The more you study it, the less innocent it becomes. At first glance, it looks like luxury raised to divine perfection. The polished floors, the endless perspective of the gardens, the chandeliers, the famous hall of mirrors, the carved wood, the silk, the fountains, the royal apartments, the soft illusion that this was a world made of elegance and nothing else. But then you start hearing the whispers behind the walls. You begin to notice the labor hidden under the shine. You realize that every magnificent room had a political purpose. Every ritual had a function. Every door, corridor, apartment, entrance, glance, invitation, and exclusion helped hold a social system together. And then suddenly, Versailles stops looking like a fairy tale and starts looking like something much more unsettling. A place where power did not merely reside, but performed itself every waking hour. And the strangest part is that it worked. For a long time, it worked magnificently. But before Versailles became the glittering center of royal France, before ambassadors stepped into it and felt smaller, before nobles ruined themselves trying to remain visible in its orbit, before queens were devoured by its gossip, before crowds marched there in fury, before history turned it into both warning and monument, it began in a way almost embarrassingly modest. That is one of the first hooks in this story, and it matters. Because the finished palace looks so inevitable now that people forget how unlikely it once was. Versailles began as a hunting lodge, not a mighty medieval seat of kings, not an ancient capital, not a place already loaded with sacred prestige, just countryside outside Paris. Windy, marshy in parts, inconvenient, unimpressive, more useful for chasing game than for governing a kingdom. Louis XIII liked the area for hunting, and in the early 17th century he built a relatively modest retreat there. Useful, private, practical enough. Nothing about it screamed destiny. Nothing about it suggested that this would one day become the most famous palace in the world. And that is precisely what makes Versailles so fascinating. It was not inherited as greatness, it was forced into greatness. Manufactured, expanded, carved, dressed, staged, and inflated until it became the physical expression of one man's idea of monarchy. That man, of course, was Louis XIV. And Louis XIV is one of those rulers whose image is so famous that it can actually hide the real reason he matters. People know the nickname, the Sun King. They know the grandeur. They know the posture, the wigs, the red heels, the rich robes, the sense of splendid absolutism. But underneath that image was something colder and sharper than simple vanity. Louis XIV understood performance. He understood that power is never only about decrees and armies. It is also about what people feel before they have had time to think. It is about atmosphere. It is about making authority seem natural, radiant, and beyond challenge. That instinct did not come from nowhere. As a child, Louis XIV experienced the Fronde, a period of civil unrest and aristocratic challenge that deeply marked him. The royal family at times was forced to flee Paris. The lesson was brutal and unforgettable. The capital could be unstable, powerful nobles could be dangerous, royal authority could look vulnerable. For a child who would grow into a monarch determined never to appear weak again, that was not a small lesson. It shaped his politics. It shaped his imagination. It shaped the emotional architecture of his reign long before the physical architecture of Versailles was complete. This is why it is too lazy to say Versailles was built only because Louis XIV had a giant ego. He did have a giant ego, no question. But ego was only part of it. Versailles was also built out of calculation, fear, and ambition, so refined that it became aesthetic. He wanted a place away from Paris, a place he could control. He wanted the nobility near him, watched, dazzled, dependent. He wanted a court that revolved around his presence so completely that noble competition would redirect itself into ceremony rather than rebellion. He wanted the image of monarchy magnified until it looked like cosmic order. And he wanted all this wrapped in beauty so overwhelming that people would mistake submission for privilege. That was the real genius of Versailles. It never presented itself as a cage. It presented itself as a dream, and people came willingly. But before they came, the dream had to be built, and what a staggering project it was. The old lodge became the core around which something much larger grew. Architects like Louis XIV, then later Jules Hardouin-Mansart, expanded and transformed the site. André Le Nôtre reshaped the grounds into a vast geometric landscape that looked less like nature and more like a kingdom disciplining nature into obedience. Charles Lebrun helped develop the visual language of royal glorification that covered ceilings and walls with allegory, triumph, classical mythology, and political theatre disguised as decoration. Nothing was casual, nothing was merely pretty. Versailles was programmed. The king's image was woven into its fabric through symbols of Apollo, light, radiance, order, and solar centrality. He did not simply want to be admired, he wanted to seem like the source from which order itself flowed. Whether or not the famous line, "I am the state," was ever literally spoken in the exact form people repeat, the mentality behind it absolutely lived at Versailles. The palace did not ask visitors to think of the king as just another powerful ruler. It nudged them toward something closer to inevitability, a force around which life arranged itself. And if that sounds theatrical, good. Because it was. Versailles was theatre at the level of civilization. Walk into the Hall of Mirrors in your mind before it became one of the most photographed places on Earth, before it became a tourist magnet and later a diplomatic stage for modern treaties. Imagine it then, lit by candlelight, alive with movement, windows opening toward the gardens, mirrors catching and multiplying every spark. Imagine jewels, embroidery, powdered hair, polished shoes, silk whispering over floorboards, servants moving discreetly at the edges, courtiers adjusting themselves under the pressure of being seen, music perhaps not always present but always implied by the rhythm of the place. That gallery did not merely reflect light, it reflected hierarchy, it reflected aspiration. It turned the bodies of the court into part of the decoration and turned the king into the most important visual fact in the room. Mirrors were expensive. Grand mirrors were a prestige technology. Venice had long excelled in that world. For France to line a massive gallery with them was not just luxurious, it was a statement. France could rival the finest luxury industries in Europe. France could produce magnificence at the highest level. France could turn light itself into propaganda. And because the mirrors faced the windows, the whole room became a machine of multiplication. Light, space, movement, glamour, power. That is the thing with Versailles. It kept turning practical elements into ideological ones. A room was never just a room. A garden was never just a garden. A corridor was never just a corridor. Space itself served politics. And nowhere was this clearer than in the rituals of court life. Today, people tend to laugh when they hear that nobles competed for the privilege of being present while the king woke up, got dressed, dined, or prepared for bed. It sounds ridiculous, and at one level it was ridiculous. But it was also deadly serious. The king's rising in the morning, the lever, was not a private domestic routine. It was a ceremonial event structured by rank. The same with the coucher at night. To be admitted into these rituals was not a trivial social nicety. It was recognition. To stand close mattered. To hand the king a garment mattered. To be seen by him in those intimate but publicized daily acts mattered because proximity to the king could be converted into influence, and influence could mean appointments, pensions, favors, opportunities, survival. Louis XIV understood that if nobles were going to compete, better they compete for access under his eye than for armed leverage in the provinces. So he transformed court life into a high-pressure ecosystem of status signals. Who entered first? Who stood where? Who had the right to sit in a royal presence? Who was invited to private suppers? Who rode in which carriage? Who was granted this office or that title? Who received a nod? Who received nothing? It sounds microscopic, but in a court like Versailles, microscopic distinctions shaped enormous consequences. Careers rose and fell on little signs. Families obsessed over precedence. Etiquette became a battlefield with lace cuffs. And that is why calling Versailles a palace is never quite enough. It was also a behavioral laboratory. It took the vanity of the nobility and weaponized it against them. Men who once might have posed real political danger spent their days managing image, seeking notice, and reading courtly weather with the desperation of gamblers. Women maneuvered too, of course, through alliances, patronage, charm, family networks, salons, religious positions, appointments, marriages, influence over access, and the infinitely subtle politics of being observed. Everyone watched everyone. Everyone judged everyone. Everyone feared slipping. Gossip was not just idle talk there, gossip was oxygen. Who had offended the king? Who had been coldly ignored? Who had overstepped? Who was seen laughing too freely? Who was rumored to be in debt? Who had gained a private audience? Who had cried after a humiliation? Who had taken a lover? Who had lost one? Who was secretly pregnant? Who had chosen the wrong fabric? Who had insulted a duchess? Who had been placed too low at table? Who had failed to show up? Who was ill? Who was dying? Who was finished? That rhythm of speculation never stopped, and because the palace was crowded with humanity under pressure, it was never as serene as the architecture suggests. Thousands moved through it: royals, nobles, attendants, ladies-in-waiting, valets, guards, priests, musicians, pages, messengers, clerks, cooks, scullions, cleaners, laundresses, stable workers, gardeners, artisans, officials, visiting diplomats, and those orbiting the orbit. The palace functioned because an enormous number of people kept it functioning. But the elegance of Versailles concealed that labor almost as effectively as it concealed discomfort. And yes, there was discomfort. This is where the romantic image of Versailles gets punctured. And it should. The palace was magnificent, but not comfortable in the modern sense. Heating was uneven. Winters could be brutal in some rooms. Drafts existed. Privacy was limited. Apartments varied in quality. Even the great beauty of the place could not cancel the fact that it was packed with bodies in a pre-modern world. Smells were real. Chamber pots were real. Waste management was imperfect. Laundry mattered because it had to. Perfumes, powders, fresh linen, gloves, scented sachets, cosmetics, and regular partial washing were all part of negotiating a world that looked more refined than it smelled. One of the most repeated claims about Versailles is that it was appallingly filthy, that courtiers urinated behind tapestries and everything was basically a perfumed nightmare. That story survives because people love seeing glamour humiliated. The truth is more nuanced, but still not flattering by modern standards. No, Versailles was not one giant open sewer in the cartoonish way some popular retellings describe it. But no, it was also not the spotless paradise of costume drama fantasy. It was crowded, imperfectly sanitary, bodily, noisy, and at times unpleasant. Refinement there did not erase physical reality. It sat on top of it like powder over skin, which makes the fashion even more revealing. Court dress was a performance of rank. Clothing at Versailles was not just personal expression, it was public language. Fabrics, embellishments, jewels, lace, wig styles, shoe decorations, swords, fans, coiffures, cosmetics, all these things communicated not only wealth but awareness, placement, belonging. To appear underdressed or carelessly dressed was to risk social damage. To appear magnificently dressed was to announce your relevance. And because relevance mattered at court, people spent recklessly. Nobles bankrupted themselves keeping up appearances because to stop performing splendor was to risk fading from notice. Versailles made visibility expensive on purpose. Now add human desire to all of that, and the court becomes combustible. Royal mistresses are always interesting, but at Versailles they became almost structural features of the political landscape. A mistress close to the king was never merely a private companion. She could become a channel of influence, a focus of envy, a target of moral outrage, a distributor of favors, a symbol of the king's appetites, and a lightning rod for every resentment in court. And because Versailles was a place where nobody minded their own business, every detail of royal intimacy became public property in one form or another. Louise de la Vallière, one of Louis XIV's earlier mistresses, often appears in the story with a kind of sadness around her. She seems almost too sincere for Versailles, as if she loved more than she strategized and therefore suffered accordingly. There is something painfully human about her role in this world. Loved by the king, envied by others, exposed to all eyes, elevated and diminished at once. Then came Madame de Montespan, and with her the emotional temperature rose. Montespan was not a figure one could ignore. She was dazzling, witty, sharp, ambitious, luxurious, imperious. Her presence filled the court. To understand how Versailles worked, you have to understand how much fascination a woman like that could generate. She had beauty, intellect, nerve, and the king's attention, which meant that for a time she also had extraordinary power. People wanted her support. People feared her tongue. People studied her rise and waited for her fall. And eventually the shadow found her. The affair of the poisons remains one of the most sinister and irresistible scandals connected to the reign of Louis XIV. It had all the ingredients that make history feel almost indecently thrilling. Poisonings real or feared, fortune-tellers, magicians, allegedly blasphemous rituals, underground dealers in love potions and lethal substances, testimony under pressure, elite clients seeking advantage, and rumors dark enough to stain the court itself. In this affair, names floated up from the underworld into the highest ranks of society, and Montespan's name hovered among the most explosive. Did she definitely participate in occult rites to secure the king's affection? That remains unproven in the sensational form people like to repeat. Some testimony implicated her. Some witnesses claimed outrageous things. Some of it may have been distorted by fear, coercion, or the fevered atmosphere of the investigation. Historians do not simply rubber stamp every dramatic accusation as fact, but the larger truth is disturbing enough. Elite society was not immune to magical thinking, poison panic, and clandestine desperation. Under all the polished etiquette, people still sought shortcuts to power, love, revenge, and security. If prayer failed, if seduction failed, if political maneuvering failed, some turned to darker alternatives. That possibility alone gave Versailles a rotten underside. Imagine a court glittering under chandeliers while whispers circulate that somewhere nearby, in rented rooms or shadowy networks, powders are being sold to kill rivals or secure lovers. That is the sort of contradiction Versailles generated constantly. Polished surface, dangerous underside. Then came Madame de Maintenon, a woman whose rise had a different flavor. Less spectacular in the flamboyant sense, more serious, more disciplined, more pious, she entered the king's world initially through the care and education of his illegitimate children. Gradually, she became indispensable. There is something fascinating about her because she represents another route to power at Versailles. Not dazzling conquest, but calm penetration. She did not blaze across the court in the style of Montespan. She settled into the king's life more quietly, perhaps more deeply. Over time, many believed, and most historians regard it as highly likely, that Louis XIV secretly married her after the death of Queen Maria Theresa. Not publicly, not in a way that could make her queen in the official dynastic sense, but privately, intimately, in a form that mattered enormously, even if it could never be fully acknowledged. That alone is vintage Versailles. The most powerful man in Europe, perhaps privately married to a woman who could not be publicly recognized as his proper royal match. Love, habit, religion, companionship, politics, self-restraint, and scandal all tangled together in one ambiguous arrangement. She could influence the king profoundly while remaining in a strange half-light of legitimacy. Too important to ignore, too awkward to formalize. That tension never disappeared. And it tells you something essential about Versailles. No matter how rigid its etiquette seemed, actual human relationships kept leaking across the boundaries. The same would later be true, with far greater consequences, for Marie Antoinette. But before she enters properly, it is worth pausing on the women around Versailles more broadly, because they were often portrayed either as decorative ornaments or as dangerous schemers. when in fact they were navigating one of the most intensely observed political environments in Europe. Ladies of rank, royal companions, princesses, mistresses, salon figures, mothers arranging marriages, women managing household influence, women cultivating networks, women trying simply not to be destroyed by gossip. All of them moved through a court where appearance mattered terribly and where one misstep could linger for years. A woman who was too charming could be called manipulative. A woman who was too reserved could be called cold. A woman who spent money was frivolous. A woman who dressed too plainly risked looking provincial or calculated. A woman close to a powerful man could rise high and then be blamed for his decisions. A woman not close enough could vanish socially. This is one reason court gossip around women was especially vicious. It fed on contradictions no woman could solve. And Versailles, with its endless appetite for spectacle, made sure such contradictions became public entertainment. Now step forward to the later 18th century and watch this machine meet the young Austrian Archduchess, who would become France's most notorious queen. Marie Antoinette arrived at Versailles not yet as the monster public imagination would later create, but as a teenager handed into a political marriage. She was young, foreign, and entering one of the most suffocating ceremonial systems in Europe. Every detail of her conduct was watched. How she walked, dressed, smiled, spoke, laughed, sat, handled etiquette, interacted with senior figures, performed piety, navigated alliances, understood French expectations, and above all produced heirs. She was not entering a home. She was entering a stage where failure would be public. And failure, or the suspicion of it, came quickly. The marriage between Marie Antoinette and the future Louis XVI became an immediate object of scrutiny because it did not produce children for years. Royal marriages were public property in a way almost impossible to imagine now. The sexual functioning of the royal couple mattered politically because succession mattered politically. If the marriage was not consummated, if no children came, if something seemed wrong, people did not shrug and give the pair privacy. They speculated, relentlessly. Was the future king impotent? Was he shy to the point of dysfunction? Did he suffer from some physical condition? Was the young Dauphin dissatisfied? Frightened? Humiliated? Did they dislike one another? Were they emotionally mismatched? Did she seek affection elsewhere? Did he? Versailles was a pressure cooker for rumor, and a delayed royal marriage gave it endless fuel. Eventually the marriage did produce children, but by then the damage was already done in another sense. Marie Antoinette had begun to develop a public image that was difficult to control. She was lively, pleasure-seeking, interested in music, fashion, private theatricals, intimate circles, and relief from the crushing stiffness of formal court ceremony. That is understandable on the human level. But politics does not care much about human relief when symbols are at stake. Her desire to escape the rigid formalities of Versailles made her look, to many observers, frivolous or contemptuous of the very system she was supposed to embody. This is where the Petit Trianon enters the mythology. The Petit Trianon had originally been built under Louis XV, but Marie Antoinette made it intimately associated with herself. She turned it into a refuge from the main court, a smaller, more controlled space where she could shape the atmosphere more to her liking. Later came the Hameau de la Reine, the Queen's Hamlet, an artificial rustic village built as a pastoral retreat. And here the gossip almost writes itself. A queen playing at rural simplicity while real peasants struggled. A queen wandering through a carefully staged little village, wrapped in expensive fabrics, cultivating a fantasy of natural life while bread crises worsened. Politically, this was disastrous. Now the most mocking version of that story is simplified. Marie Antoinette was not literally trying to become a real peasant woman. The Hamlet was a fashionable aristocratic retreat reflecting elite taste for idealized nature. But that distinction barely matters when the public mood turns. It still looked like detachment. It still looked like privileged play. It still handed critics a symbol too perfect to resist. And by then, the propaganda around her had become vicious. The libels, scurrilous, scandalous pamphlets, did immense damage to her reputation. They portrayed her as sexually depraved, financially reckless, morally diseased, politically treacherous, and grotesquely extravagant. Some were pornographic, some absurd, some wildly defamatory. Yet they worked because they gave form to public resentment. Once a queen is successfully recast as the embodiment of elite corruption, every expense confirms it, every gesture feeds it, and even innocence can begin to look suspicious. Then came the most famous quote of all, the one almost certainly never said, "Let them eat cake." It is one of history's most efficient lies. Short, unforgettable, cruel, and perfectly targeted. The phrase, in different form, existed earlier and was not uniquely attached to Marie Antoinette in any reliable contemporary evidence that proves she said it. Historians overwhelmingly reject it as authentic. Yet the sentence survived because it expressed the emotional truth her enemies wanted to spread. They wanted her to stand for a kind of monstrous aristocratic oblivion so total that starvation could be answered with dessert. It was too neat a line to die, even if false. That is one of the brutal truths about Versailles and the people trapped in it. Image could outrun fact. Once an image took hold, facts had difficulty catching up. The diamond necklace affair is perhaps the finest example of that. It sounds like a mad aristocratic thriller. A spectacularly expensive necklace, jewelers desperate to sell it, a vain cardinal eager to restore royal favor, forged letters pretending to be from the queen, a con woman orchestrating deceit, and even a prostitute disguised as Marie Antoinette in a nighttime meeting that convinced the gullible cardinal he was secretly reconciling with her. The queen, in fact, had refused the necklace and did not create the fraud. But when the scandal exploded publicly, it reinforced the existing suspicion that the monarchy was swimming in luxury, trickery, and dishonor. The queen's direct innocence mattered less than the fact that the story fit the public's appetite to believe the worst. Versailles excelled at creating precisely that kind of symbolic vulnerability. It had turned the monarchy into spectacle so successfully that when scandal attached to the spectacle, the damage multiplied. And all the while, the palace itself continued to radiate control. The gardens remained a masterpiece of discipline imposed on landscape. This is worth lingering over because the gardens are often admired for beauty, when they should also be read as argument. Under André Le Nôtre, the grounds were transformed into long axes, vast parterres, reflecting pools, sculptural groupings, hidden groves, controlled vistas, and mathematically convincing expressions of order. Nature did not ramble there, it obeyed. Trees aligned, paths disciplined the eye, water was captured and directed. Everything suggested that under royal power, even the land could be taught to behave. That was never merely decorative. It was ideological. The palace told you what the king was. The gardens told you what the king could do. He could make disorder submit. But even there, reality pressed back. The fountains, so famous today, were part of that theatre of mastery. Yet they demanded immense quantities of water that the site struggled to provide. Engineers built remarkable systems to improve the supply, and the machine de Marly became one of the era's grand feats of hydraulic ambition. Still, there was never enough to satisfy the fantasy of limitless display. So fountain operators often had to choreograph the spectacle. Some jets would be activated when the king approached a section of the grounds and turned down after he passed, creating the impression of effortless abundance. That detail is almost too perfect. Even the water at Versailles had to flatter authority on cue. This is why the place feels so psychologically rich. Nothing was allowed to appear strained, even when strain was everywhere. Not in the fountains, not in the clothing, not in the court smiles, not in the finances, not in the political structure. Versailles ran on hidden effort. The cleaner the surface, the more fascinating the concealed machinery underneath. That concealed machinery included enormous human labor. One of the biggest distortions in the romantic image of Versailles is how invisible the workers become. Yet the palace and gardens existed only because thousands labored relentlessly. Masons, plasterers, carpenters, carvers, mirror makers, bronze workers, painters, seamstresses, upholsterers, cooks, dishwashers, scullions, footmen, valets, stable hands, laundresses, gardeners, fountain operators, musicians, clerks, guards, messengers, domestic staff. A whole world of labor was required to make royal magnificence look effortless. Every polished room represented upkeep. Every dinner represented kitchen toil. Every clipped hedge represented human bodies at work. Every spotless silk curtain represented washing, mending, replacement, and cost. And this labor supported not simply comfort, but display. Versailles was not a machine designed to make people happy. It was a machine designed to make hierarchy visible. The workers helped produce that visibility, but remained largely uncelebrated within it. This tension matters because it mirrors the larger contradiction of the monarchy itself. Stunning artistic achievement built on deeply unequal structures. As long as France remained politically manageable, the contradictions could be absorbed into spectacle. But contradictions do not vanish because ceilings are painted beautifully. They accumulate. Louis XV inherited the system after Louis XIV, and Versailles continued as the center of court life, though with changes in tone, atmosphere, and royal personality. Louis XV did not command the same monumental aura as his predecessor, though he maintained the court and its culture. He too had his own famous circle of women, including Madame de Pompadour and later Madame du Barry, each of whom generated fascination, jealousy, and commentary in her own way. Pompadour especially deserves attention because she shows another way influence worked at Versailles. She was not just a mistress in the superficial sense. She became a major cultural patron and political presence, deeply involved in artistic life and close to the king far beyond the period of their physical affair. Clever, stylish, politically aware, and resilient, she built a role that outlasted the ordinary shelf life of royal intimacy. Her enemies mocked her bourgeois origins and condemned her influence. But she understood Versailles well enough to shape it. She patronized artists, impacted taste, and remained a significant figure in the king's inner world. Then came Madame du Barry, whose presence was differently scandalous because of her origins and the contempt she inspired among certain aristocratic circles. If Pompadour had cultivated refinement as a shield, du Barry's rise ignited more open snobbery and disgust in some quarters. Court women who saw themselves as guardians of dignity treated her existence as an insult. Even a single required greeting to her could become a drama. Here again, Versailles reveals itself as a place where tiny gestures carried enormous weight. A princess or young dauphine refusing to speak to the king's mistress could cause intense tension precisely because Versailles converted manners into political signals. And it was under Louis XV that the phrase "Après moi le déluge" is often associated, whether or not in the simplified form people repeat. The line captures an atmosphere people like to project onto late monarchy. Pleasure, exhaustion, fragility, indifference to looming ruin. Whether the phrase itself should be loaded too heavily is another matter. But the mood it evokes would later cling even more fiercely to the world Versailles represented. By the time Louis XVI came to the throne, the setting was still magnificent, but the pressures outside and beneath it had deepened. France's financial problems were no longer manageable ornaments at the edge of the system. Debt weighed heavily. Wars, including support for the American War of Independence, had drained the treasury. The tax system remained unjust and inefficient. Privileged estates resisted bearing fair burdens. Reforms stumbled against entrenched interests. Bad harvests worsened suffering. Bread prices could devastate ordinary people. Political discourse sharpened. Criticism spread more widely. Confidence ebbed. And still, Versailles glittered. There is something almost cinematic in that image, a state drifting toward crisis while the palace continues to stage control. Fountains sparkle, courtiers bow, fabrics rustle, dining rituals continue, carriages move, gardeners trim, musicians perform, hairdressers build improbable structures over powdered heads, servants light candles in rooms covered with allegories of triumph. It all continues because systems of ceremony are often the last things to admit reality. But the admission would come. Louis XVI has often been mocked as weak, and there is truth in the sense that he lacked the theatrical command that a palace like Versailles almost demanded. He was not built like Louis XIV for imperial performance. He could be conscientious, intelligent in some ways, earnest, but also indecisive, awkward, unable to dominate the symbolic machinery he inherited. That matters because Versailles did not simply house monarchy. It amplified monarchy, and amplification is dangerous if the central figure cannot fill the stage. Under Louis XIV, the palace magnified confidence. Under Louis XVI, it could magnify uncertainty. Meanwhile, the Queen's public image deteriorated further. Her spending became infamous, though often exaggerated compared with the scale of larger fiscal problems. Her private amusements were interpreted as political evidence. Her foreign birth remained suspect. Her circle aroused resentment. The combination of real privilege and invented monstrosity turned her into the perfect target. The monarchy as a whole began to appear less sacred, more absurd, and more parasitic. This is where the brilliance of Versailles starts to turn against itself. The same palace that once made royal power look untouchable now made royal distance look obscene. And once that shift happens in the public imagination, beauty becomes dangerous. It no longer persuades, it accuses. The calling of the Estates General in 1789 was already a sign that ordinary mechanisms had failed. When a monarchy structured around absolutist prestige has to summon representatives in that context, it is acknowledging deep strain. Events then accelerated rapidly. The National Assembly formed. Tensions between crown and political forces intensified. Paris grew volatile. The fall of the Bastille transformed the emotional atmosphere of the kingdom. Fear, hope, rumor, hunger, political energy, and rage moved faster than courtly ritual ever could. Then came the October days. This is one of the moments where Versailles and history collide so dramatically that the symbolism almost overwhelms the facts. Women from Paris, many driven by bread shortages and political fury, marched to Versailles, joined by others along the way. They were not courtiers. They were not invited. They were not playing according to the old rules of access. They were forced from outside the ceremonial world, and they were bringing reality with them. Think about what that meant. Versailles had always depended on control of access. It was the palace where the monarchy staged separation, managed visibility, choreographed approach, and kept the court within a world of rank and ritual. Now that distance was being broken by crowds whose anger did not care about etiquette. Guards were attacked, violence erupted. The palace was no longer merely a symbol of authority. It was physically exposed to the pressures it had been built to keep at arm's length. One can almost feel the terror and disbelief inside the royal apartments. The world outside the performance had arrived at the performance's door. And the old mechanisms had no answer for that. Soon after, the royal family left Versailles for Paris. In one sense, this was simply movement. In a larger sense, it was an exorcism. Versailles had ceased to function as the beating heart of monarchical power. The palace remained standing, but the political center it was designed to host had drained out of it. The great stage was losing its actors. There is something haunting about that. Places built for concentrated power often become uncanny when the power leaves. The architecture remains, but the purpose fades. Rooms designed for public rituals fall silent. Corridors that once carried whispers of ambition carry only footsteps. The Hall of Mirrors still reflects, but it reflects absence. One imagines Versailles after the departure of the court, not yet museum, not yet stabilized into historical memory, but emptied of the choreography that gave it its daily meaning. A palace of performance without performers. A shell of magnificence. And yet Versailles did not die. It changed roles. During the Revolution, the palace was stripped of much of its original furnishing. Objects were sold, dispersed, removed. That, too, was symbolic. The world that had used things to stage hierarchy was dismantling piece by piece. But the structure itself remained too massive, too beautiful, too historically saturated to vanish easily. France had to decide what to do with this impossible inheritance, a masterpiece built by a monarchy it no longer trusted. In the 19th century, under Louis Philippe, Versailles was reframed as a museum devoted to all the glories of France. This was an ingenious reinvention. Instead of remaining the private shrine of Bourbon absolutism, the palace could become nationalized as a monument to broader French history. A place once designed to glorify one ruler could now help tell a story about the nation. That shift did not erase the old meanings, but it added new ones. Versailles could be preserved without simply restoring the world that made it infamous, and history kept using the place. In 1871, the German Empire was proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors after France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, a calculated humiliation. Then in 1919, after the First World War, The Treaty of Versailles was signed there, turning the palace yet again into a stage for the politics of Europe. It is extraordinary when you think about it. A room created to magnify the self-image of Louis XIV went on to host events that shaped modern international history. Versailles kept reflecting more than its builders intended. But perhaps the reason it remains so compelling is not only what happened there. It is what it reveals about human beings. Because Versailles is not really distant from us in the ways that matter most. The fashions have changed, the wigs are gone, the swords, the powdered faces, the public dressing rituals, the strict court hierarchies of chairs and precedents, all that belongs to another world. But the instincts under them are familiar. The hunger for visibility, the obsession with image, the scramble for proximity to power, the weaponization of gossip, the way systems reward performance over substance, the way women in public life become screens for collective hatred and fantasy, the way elites convince themselves that beauty and ritual can compensate for structural rot, the way institutions mistake staging for stability. That is why Versailles still feels alive. It is not just a relic, it is a mirror. And like all good mirrors, it flatters and exposes at the same time. If you walk mentally through its galleries now, you can almost hear both stories at once. On one side, the story the palace wanted to tell. Order, grace, permanence, civilization at its highest polish, monarchy as harmony. The king at the center, like the sun around which all else turns. On the other side, the story history uncovered. Labor, waste, vanity, desire, favoritism, debt, humiliation, exclusion, symbolic blindness, political fragility, and the long fatal delay before a system realizes that performance can no longer protect it. Even the myths around Versailles tell us something important. Take the quote, "Let them eat cake." False, most likely, but immortal because it compressed public resentment into one unforgettable sentence. Take the tale that Versailles was impossibly filthy, exaggerated in its most lurid forms, yet rooted in the real discomfort and bodily reality of the palace. Take the rumors of poison, occult rites, black masses, secret marriages, hidden lovers, scandalous pamphlets, staged peasant games, and diamond fraud. Some are partially true, some distorted, some impossible to prove fully. But all of them reveal a court so saturated with performance and appetite that almost any rumor felt plausible. That is not a small point. A rumor becomes powerful when it fits the emotional truth of a place. At Versailles, the emotional truth was that beneath all the order, people sensed volatility. Beneath all the glitter, they sensed greed and competition. Beneath the piety, appetite. Beneath the beauty, costs. Beneath the serenity, strain. That is why gossip flourished so well there. It fed on contradiction, and contradiction is really the core of Versailles. It is one of the most beautiful environments humans have ever made, and also one of the clearest monuments to political distortion. It is a triumph of art and a warning about power. It is discipline and decadence in the same breath. It is the place where adults in embroidered clothes fought over ridiculous privileges, but also the place where architecture, landscape, decorative arts, and ceremonial design reached extraordinary levels of refinement. It is the place where a queen's private retreat could become a national symbol of elite detachment. It is the place where a king used grandeur to master the nobility, only for that same grandeur to later help condemn the monarchy. It is the place where reality was delayed by beauty, but not defeated by it. And maybe that final point is why Versailles never stops haunting people. Beauty delayed reality. What a sentence. What a dangerous human dream. That is what Versailles attempted on a colossal scale. Not to eliminate conflict, or inequity, or fear, or resentment, or instability, but to stage a world so persuasive that those things would remain hidden, at least long enough. Long enough for the king to reign in splendor. Long enough for nobles to bow willingly. Long enough for the court to keep dancing. But reality is rude. It walks in eventually. The deeper you go into the story, the harder it becomes to separate the magnificent from the absurd. Consider the morning rituals again. Consider grown aristocrats treating the handing of a sleeve or the presence at a royal meal as an event of enormous consequence. Ridiculous. Yes, but also logical within the system. That is the discomfort. Versailles took silly human impulses, vanity, ambition, envy, hunger for recognition, and integrated them into government. It did not eliminate pettiness. It elevated pettiness into structure. That is part of its brilliance and part of its corruption. Or think of the Queen's Hamlet. On one level, it is almost laughable, an expensive pastoral fantasy for elite amusement. On another level, it is quite moving in a warped way because it shows how desperately artificial court life had become if even privileged people longed for a stylized image of simplicity. But then the political reality returns and kills the tenderness. This was a stylized rural retreat, while actual rural hardship and urban hunger intensified in France. The emotional symbolism overwhelms the nuance. That keeps happening at Versailles. Human complexity appears, and then politics devours it. Marie Antoinette was not the cartoon monster created by propaganda, but she was also not a misunderstood innocent floating in pure victimhood. She lived inside a system of privilege and benefited from it extravagantly. Yet the hatred directed at her was inflated, sexualized, misogynistic, conspiratorial, and often detached from fact. That mixture is exactly what makes her story so enduring. She became both a person and a vessel for public rage. Versailles made such transformations easier by turning the royal family into visible symbols all the time. The more theatrical the monarchy, the more vulnerable it became to symbolic attack. The same can be said of Louis XVI in a different way. He was not simply a fool. He was a man poorly fitted to the grand machinery he inherited, a ruler whose uncertainties were magnified by a palace designed for certainty. There is something almost tragic in imagining him moving through rooms built to project confidence on an imperial scale, while his own instinct leaned toward hesitation. Versailles did not merely shelter him, it exposed his inadequacy more starkly. And this is why the palace still speaks so powerfully to modern audiences. We live in an age saturated with image, branding, public performance, status signals, controlled access, symbolic gestures, carefully managed spectacle, and institutions terrified of looking weak. Versailles was doing all of that in silk and gold centuries ago. It just did it with more candles and fewer cameras. That does not make it less relevant, it makes it disturbingly relevant. What happens when leaders confuse image with legitimacy? What happens when a ruling class spends so long curating prestige that it stops understanding ordinary reality? What happens when aesthetics become a shield against criticism? What happens when everyone inside a system becomes more skilled at reading symbolic gestures than reading actual danger? Versailles offers one answer. The system can look flawless right up until the moment it stops working, and still, even after all the critique, even after all the irony, even after all the blood and rumor and excess and collapse, the palace itself remains astonishing. That cannot be honestly denied. It is not enough to sneer at Versailles as merely vulgar excess, because the place is too artistically powerful for that. The gardens are genuinely extraordinary. The Hall of Mirrors really is breathtaking. The planning, decoration, and ambition of the whole enterprise remain among the high achievements of human creativity. Dismissing it as just an expensive ego trip misses the real complexity. Versailles is art in the service of something troubling. That is a harder thing to sit with, but it is the truth. And perhaps that is why the palace endures so strongly in the imagination. It does not ask for a simple response. It does not allow one. You cannot admire it innocently, and you cannot condemn it without also acknowledging the brilliance involved in making it. You have to hold both. You have to feel the pull of the beauty and the discomfort of what that beauty served. You have to let the mirrors dazzle you and then remember what they were there to do. Versailles wanted to make monarchy look eternal. That was the project. More than housing the court, more than displaying wealth, more than entertaining Europe. Versailles was meant to make hierarchy look natural, luminous, and permanent. For a while, it succeeded. Nobles submitted, ambassadors were impressed, artists were mobilized, fashion spread outward. French cultural prestige deepened. The court moved through its rituals as if the world it represented might actually last forever. And then it didn't. That failure is the palace's final shadow. All that magnificence, all that choreography, all that ordering of nature and people and light and fabric and furniture and ceremony, and still the system cracked. The king who made himself sun-like could not command time. The palace that seemed to dominate landscape could not dominate history. The court that turned etiquette into power could not stop hunger and debt and public anger from remaking the country around it. In the end, the mirrors kept reflecting, but what they reflected changed. That is the deepest fascination of Versailles. It is a monument not merely to power, but to power's delusions. It shows how far human beings can go in creating environments of astonishing sophistication. It shows how brilliantly art can be used to support political systems. It shows how fragile those systems remain when they stop seeing clearly. It shows that a palace can be both masterpiece and evidence. And it shows with devastating clarity that spectacle can delay reality but never abolish it. So when modern visitors walk through Versailles, camera in hand, pausing under painted ceilings, staring at the hall of mirrors, moving out toward the terraces and gardens, they are seeing more than royal luxury. Whether they feel it fully or not, they are walking through a machine that once trained an entire elite to revolve around one center. They are walking through the architecture of controlled access, through the geometry of prestige, through the memory of whispered humiliations and expensive triumphs, through rooms where queens were watched, where mistresses rose and fell, where political theater fused with domestic ritual, where workers moved invisibly beneath aristocratic display, where everything looked stable until it wasn't. And that is why Versailles remains unforgettable. Not because it was perfect, because it was impossible. Because it tried to transform a kingdom into an audience. Because it tried to make power look like beauty, and beauty look like order, and order look like destiny. Because it revealed how much human beings will endure, spend, fake, flatter, whisper, posture, desire, resent, and obey inside a system built on visibility. Because it remains one of the clearest examples in history of a ruling world so committed to its own image that it could no longer tell when the image had started turning against it. And because even now, after everything, the spell still works a little. You still look at Versailles and feel the pull. That matters. It means the builders succeeded. The place really can overwhelm you. The scale still intimidates, the symmetry still seduces. The mirrors still multiply wonder. The gardens still feel like a kind of impossible dream imposed on the earth. But if you stay with the story long enough, the dream sharpens. You begin to see the workers behind the fountain spray, the debt behind the chandeliers, the panic behind the ritual, the rumor behind the smile, the fear behind the magnificence, the loneliness inside the formal apartments, the absurdity of grown adults structuring their existence around who may hand a napkin to a king, the danger of turning image into system. Then Versailles stops being just beautiful. It becomes intelligible. And once that happens, it becomes even more interesting. Because now you are no longer just looking at a palace. You are looking at one of the most complete performances of power ever staged. A place where architecture, etiquette, fashion, landscape, gossip, desire, labor, art, rank, and ritual all fused into one immense attempt to control reality by controlling appearances. For a while, the attempt seemed almost divine. Then history walked in and refused to play its assigned role. That is Versailles, a hunting lodge made into a kingdom's heart, a king's fear turned into marble and mirrors, a court turned into a cage and taught to love its bars, a queen turned into a symbol and then devoured by it, a masterpiece built to glorify monarchy and later preserved to remind the world how glory can blind, a place where water itself was trained to flatter power, a place where beauty reached its highest refinement and still could not save the people who depended on it, a place that wanted to look eternal and instead became unforgettable.